You're new, aren't you? I thought so. What you're gonna have to understand is that a lot of the men here, a lot of the boys here, have been here for months, years in some cases, and that the very qualities that make the Haute-Jura such a suitable location for the resistance to hide away and launch operations from, that is to say, the impenetrable forests, the inaccessibility, the altitude, the bitter winters, all these things make the place quite hard to live in. And that's when you're not being hounded by the Vichy police or the German army, as we have been over the last few months. But don't worry, we're in a good mood. The Allies have established a bridgehead on the Normandy coast. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a victory of our own. Come inside. I'll tell you all about it. What do you know about Ambrieux? No reason you should know anything at all, really, unless you're a railway enthusiast. It's a big rail yard, the biggest in this region. You know, 2 huge engine sheds, 3 turntables, all kinds of workshops for repairs, anything between 60 and 100 locomotive engines at any one time, and even a 50-ton crane that they used to put derailed trains back on the tracks. Trains as often as not derailed by us, of course, at the moment. And because of that, protected by 2 armoured carriages stuffed with small arms and light machine guns and heavy machine guns and even a 20mm anti-aircraft cannon, if you can believe it. But that meant that Ambrieux was a target, and the Germans knew it. For which reason they made sure that there was a guard of at least 50 there, day and night, round the clock. And as tempting as that was, we were perfectly aware that it would be a tough nut to crack. But we had an incentive. London had been in touch to tell us that there was a big push coming in the north, and our job was to keep the Germans busy and pinned down in the south. And if we didn't, they made it clear that they'd take matters into their own hands, and that meant the RAF and bombing raids, and that meant civilian casualties, and we weren't prepared to countenance that, so we put together an operation. And we headed off in the middle of the night on the 6th of June, some 10 days ago, in our trucks, in the dark, in the blackout. Obviously we knew the way, and our drivers had trained for this kind of fun and games, so we managed to reach Ambrieux without a hitch, taking a big detour to approach it from the south, and stop the trucks about 500 metres away from the Pont d'Albarine, which is where we'd agreed to meet the railway workers, debussed and made the rest of the route on foot, Indian file in silence, in the darkness. And when we met with the railway workers, it seemed that everything planned was in place. Even the weather was on our side. It was drizzling lightly, overcast, obviously perfect for our purposes. The only disappointment was that the 50-ton crane had set off for Lyon earlier that day and could no longer be one of our objectives. So there was nothing to do but wait for each hour. And anyone who's been in combat will tell you that that's the worst part. The minutes crawled by like years. We kept checking our watches. We talked about anything other than the operation itself. And then finally, it was 10 to 1. And the 2 teams whose objectives was furthest off set off into the darkness. And then 10 minutes later, the siren sounded. That was all part of the plan. A different team, Equipe Nicole. Their job had been to go and find the installation where the Germans kept the controls for the air raid warning siren, to take it and to set it off. Because we knew that the Germans and the railway workers, their drill, in the case of an air raid warning, was to head for the bunkers and the air raid shelters, so the site would be clear, or at least that was the plan. So the siren going off was our signal, and as such it came as a great relief because we were going in, but at the same time, of course, my blood turned to water because it meant we were going in. One after the other, each team disappeared into the night. Each team had a railway worker leading it to show them where to put the charges. Men carrying the charges themselves, little 300-gram packages of plastic explosive and the detonators, and then a couple of boys who were for security, who were carrying the weapons. Once they were gone, the commander and I waited, and it didn't seem like any time at all before we started to hear gunfire and shouting and cries of alarm, and I began to think, did we plan for everything? Have we missed something? Are we walking into a trap? The commander suggested that we go in a bit closer to see if we could find out what was going on, and we did, and we practically tripped over Mazot and Soupilé, who had somehow wrestled a German to the ground and disarmed him, and he was screaming his head off, and we lent a hand, but there was nothing it seemed we could do to shut him up, and I was thinking, this is it, the game's up, we're finished, when all of a sudden, the night sky lit up with an explosion. And then for about half an hour, it seemed there was just explosion after explosion after explosion. Some really big ones that rocked the ground under your feet. Those must have been the turntables. And then all was quiet. Or quiet-ish, at least. Because still you could hear rifle fire, and now it was punctuated with machine gun fire. And the Germans must have got wind of what we were about, and it was time to withdraw. So the commander and I made our way back to the rendezvous point, and we waited. And again, the time went by painfully slowly, but the groups came back in, one after the other, after the next, until there were only 5 men who we hadn't accounted for. And then the commander said, it's no good, we have to go. And he gave the tough order to withdraw, asking the railway workers who were remaining behind to hang on as long as they could to see if they could pick up the stragglers. And back in the trucks we went, and back here we came. But we didn't relax. I don't think any of us slept a wink that night. And when dawn broke, to our great relief, word came from the railway workers that the 5 missing men were in a safe house. One had been wounded in the thigh, but was receiving medical attention, and they were all right. And then we started celebrating. Celebrating because news also came that we had rendered inoperable 52 locomotive engines. All 3 turntables were out of action for several days. The engine sheds were badly damaged, and we had damaged almost beyond repair all the workshops, apart from one. And that was Butow's objective. Butow was furious. It was almost comical how angry he was. It wasn't his fault. No one blamed him. He'd gone in for his objective, of course, but he'd gone down one route, and the Germans had shot at him with submachine guns, and so he'd gone down another route, and the same thing had happened, and so he'd have to give up. But he said to André Magdeleine, and I thought he was joking, that if he hadn't been able to complete it in the night shift, he'd do it in the day. And he did. Today, 17th of June, 10 days later, he walked back into that devastated rail yard, slipped past the German guards, I don't know how, with his charge of 300 grams of plastic explosive and his detonators, made his way to the workshop, laid the charge, and walked calmly back out again. Incredible. You know, there are lots of different kinds of resistance. There's the quiet resistance of non-compliance. There's the resistance of harbouring fugitives or maquisards. There's the noisier resistance of sabotage, and the deafening resistance of battle, like with us a couple of months ago, or at Glières. And I wouldn't like to say for sure which requires the greatest nerve. But I will say this, that as long as there are people like Butow in this world, the flame of resistance will never be extinguished.